42 days of relentless, grinding combat without a single change of clothes or a warm meal will transform a boy into a ghost before he even realizes he is dead. The scent of cordite and frozen earth becomes your only reality until the world beyond the trench feels like a fever dream from another life. We were sent into the meat grinder when the Great Continental Conflict was at its most desperate peak, and by the end, we were barely men at all. I learned that survival isn't about bravery, but about the mechanical persistence of moving one foot in front of the other while the world screams in iron. We almost got annihilated in the shadow of a city that didn't even want to be saved. I would eventually find myself standing in a dimly lit office, listening to the rhythmic, soul-crushing snip of a blade removing the rank from my shoulders. It was a strange end to a journey that spanned 2 oceans and several lifetimes of terror. I had survived the worst the enemy could throw at me, only to be defeated by a few bottles of beer and a stubborn sense of loyalty. Looking back, it seems almost poetic that I exited the military with the same empty sleeves I had when I entered. The journey from a private to a private was paved with more blood and fire than any rank could ever justify. It all truly began on a quiet Sunday morning in 1941 when I was just a 15-year-old kid scrubbing the scales off a sport fishing vessel. We had experienced incredible luck the day before, but the water was stingy that morning, leaving me with nothing to do but fiddle with the radio in the wheelhouse. A voice crackled through the static, announcing an invasion that sounded too much like the radio plays about Martians we had heard years prior. I didn't pay it much mind at first, assuming it was another theatrical performance designed to rattle the nerves of the civilian population. However, the captain's face went pale as he began cycling through the channels, hearing the same grim report mirrored across every frequency. They wouldn't let our little boat back into the harbor until the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long orange shadows across the water. Huge submarine nets had been stretched across the mouth of Long Beach, and the atmosphere was thick with a new, sharp kind of tension. When we finally docked, military police boarded our vessel and took 3 men away simply because they couldn't produce the proper identification papers. That was the last time I saw a sport fishing boat in the water until the global nightmare finally reached its conclusion years later. My childhood effectively ended that afternoon as the harbor fell silent under the weight of an uncertain future. I walked into the Army on March the 30th, having rushed through my high school graduation in February just to meet the call of duty. I had signed my name for the draft in December and stood shivering through my physical examination in the cold halls of January. Basic training at Camp Roberts in California was a whirlwind of red dust and screaming sergeants who tried to burn the boy out of us. Eventually, I was transferred into the 97th Infantry Division, where our training became hyper-focused on the specific horrors of the European theater. We knew where we were going, but none of us truly understood the scale of the devastation that awaited us across the Atlantic. When the news broke that Blackwood was surrounded during the height of the winter offensive, they loaded us onto a refit luxury liner called the Gilded Empress. We were packed like sardines 5 decks down, well below the waterline, where the hum of the engines was a constant reminder of our vulnerability. If a torpedo had struck the hull, we would have been entombed in a steel coffin before we could even reach the stairs. They only allowed us 30 minutes of fresh air on deck in the morning and another 30 in the late afternoon. The rest of our time was spent in the stifling, smoke-filled hold, where duffel bags and rifles were stacked as high as the bunks. By the time our boots finally hit the soil of the old world, the initial desperation of the siege had begun to subside into a grueling war of attrition. We didn't participate in the famous relief of the surrounded pocket, but we were immediately pushed toward the heart of the enemy's territory. Our path led us into the treacherous river valleys along the Silver Stream, moving steadily toward the industrial stronghold of Oakhaven. It was there that we entered our first true engagement, a 45-day nightmare that seemed to exist outside the boundaries of time and space. We were raw, untested, and about to be initiated into a world where mercy was a luxury no one could afford. That 45-day stretch was a descent into a primal state of existence where the basic comforts of humanity were stripped away one by one. I went the entire duration without a change of underwear, without clean clothes, and without a single hot meal to warm my shivering insides. In those 6 weeks, I only had a roof over my head for 2 nights, usually in the ruins of a cellar that smelled of damp rot. Every single day was punctuated by the whistle of incoming rounds and the frantic scramble for cover in the freezing mud. We were doing all of this for $30 a month, which was reduced to $21 after the mandatory insurance deductions. The initiation at the border town of Seatburg was particularly brutal as we clawed our way toward the city of Oakhaven. Our objective was to secure the city before the Eastern Coalition forces could arrive from the opposite direction to claim the territory. It took us 45 days to cover a distance that would take a modern car less than an hour to traverse. There was no joy in the progress, only the singular, exhausting desire to stay alive for one more hour. We functioned on a schedule of standing guard for 60 minutes and sleeping for 60, meaning we were perpetually lost in a fog of exhaustion. If we were ever granted a 15-minute break during a march, I could be sound asleep within the first 5. I served as the Model 7 man for my infantry platoon, carrying a heavy automatic rifle that weighed nearly 20 pounds. While the standard infantryman carried a light 8-pound rifle, my weapon possessed the terrifying firepower of a portable machine gun. The drawback was the weight and the limited 20-round magazines that I had to swap out constantly during the heat of a firefight. I wore a belt heavy with spare magazines and draped a canvas bandolier over my shoulder to ensure I never ran dry. My assistant gunner carried an equal load of ammunition, ensuring that we were a walking arsenal capable of suppressing an entire enemy squad. However, the prestige of the Model 7 came with a heavy price tag that we all understood too well. To the enemy snipers and machine gunners, I was the primary target, ranked even higher on their list than the regular rifleman. They knew that if they could take out the automatic rifle, the rest of the platoon's offensive power would be cut in half. I lived with the constant knowledge that a dozen eyes were likely searching for the silhouette of my heavy barrel at any given moment. During one particularly tense afternoon, a rogue enemy tank crossed our path, its iron tracks screeching against the cobblestones of a ruined village. One of our boys managed to knock it out with a well-placed bazooka round that sent a plume of black smoke billowing into the gray sky. I was the first one to reach the charred hull of the beast, my weapon leveled at the command hatch as it slowly creaked open. An officer emerged, blinking in the harsh light and looking directly down the barrel of my Model 7 with wide, terrified eyes. He was wearing a magnificent fur-lined field jacket that looked warmer than anything I had ever seen in my life. I took that jacket from him, along with his sidearm, and I didn't feel a single ounce of guilt for doing so. Over the following weeks, I meticulously removed the fur from his coat and hand-sewed it into the lining of my own field jacket. I did this in small increments whenever we had a few moments of peace, using a needle and thread I kept in my kit. Not long after, I was peppered with small fragments of shrapnel during a mortar barrage that caught us in the open. Between my wool undershirt, my sweater, and that thick fur lining, the metal bits just stuck in the fabric like needles in a pincushion. The shrapnel did draw a bit of blood, but it wasn't enough to warrant a trip to the medical tent where I might be separated from my unit. I simply stayed down and kept moving, unlike our radio man who seemed to have the strangest luck in the entire company. He was a small, wiry man who hauled a massive radio set on his back while trailing the captain like a faithful shadow. One day he tripped over a loose stone and skinned his hand just as a medic happened to be walking past our position. The medic treated the minor scratch, filled out the necessary paperwork, and the radio man ended up with a Purple Heart for his trouble. One evening, we holed up in a dense thicket of trees, staring out at a vast open field that led toward the next town we had to clear. The brass decided to bring up 5 tanks to lead our advance across that exposed space, hoping the armor would provide a moving shield. However, the road ahead performed a sharp U-turn, a geographical feature the enemy had zeroed in on with mathematical precision. They knocked out those 5 tanks one by one, turning the armored vanguard into a row of burning, blackened husks in a matter of minutes. Despite the carnage, the high-ranking officers ordered us to advance through the open field anyway, ignoring the obvious trap. We were almost annihilated as we stepped out from the tree line and into the sights of the hidden machine gun nests. My next step was destined to be into a massive bomb crater, so I simply dove headfirst into the dirt and didn't look back. I spent the entire day huddled in that muddy hole, listening to the world being torn apart by lead and steel just feet above my head. My squad leader eventually managed to jump in from the opposite side, and the two of us shared that cramped sanctuary until the sun finally set. At 19 years old, I was still foolish enough to occasionally peek over the rim to see if I could catch a glimpse of the shooters. Every time I moved, I could feel the heat of a burst of fire passing through the air where my head had been seconds before. The enemy knew we were in that crater, and they periodically sent a blast of fire into the dirt mounds to keep us pinned and terrified. We couldn't crawl out until the cover of darkness finally arrived, accompanied by a thick screen of mortar-fired smoke that obscured the field. We took a devastating toll that day, losing good men because the officers were more concerned with a schedule than with the reality on the ground. The enemy machine guns were technically superior to ours, firing 1,100 rounds per minute compared to our 550. You could hear the difference in the cadence of the gunfire, a terrifying ripsaw sound that signaled the presence of their heavy weapons. Over time, you grow hardened to the horror, and the act of shooting before you are shot becomes a subconscious way of life. You don't have time to process the morality of the situation or the fear of the unknown. You simply mimic the actions of the men around you. It is a visceral, mechanical existence where the bang-bang of war becomes the only language you speak fluently. We thought we would finally get a reprieve in Oakhaven, as I was next in line for a 3-day pass to the coast. Just as I was preparing my gear for the trip, the order came down to grab our rucksacks and load into the transport trucks. We were being transferred into General Sterling's Third Army and sent racing toward the Eastern Front as the enemy's defense began to crumble. After several hours of bumpy travel, the trucks pulled up alongside a massive indoor Olympic-style swimming pool that had been seized by our engineers. They had managed to get the industrial heaters working, providing us with the first opportunity for a communal bath in months. We stripped off our filth-encrusted rags, climbed into the warm water, and felt the weight of the war wash away for a few golden minutes. We were issued clean clothes, and as I pulled on a fresh shirt, I felt as though I had been born again into a new world. A dispatch rider came screaming through the area shortly after, shouting the incredible news that the enemy had officially surrendered and the war in Europa was over. We weren't quite ready to believe it at first, because the momentum of the conflict was still pulsing through our veins. I always compare it to a championship football game where the clock runs out while you are inches away from the goal line and trailing by a few points. You want one more play to finish what you started, but then the reality of peace finally sinks in and you feel a profound sense of gratitude. We were sent back to the coast where we were told that we would have the entire month of July to spend with our families back home. There was a long, pregnant pause after that announcement before the officer added that we would then undergo 6 weeks of specialized training. We were being prepared for the final invasion of the Sun Kingdom in the Pacific, a prospect that hung over our homecomings like a dark, heavy cloud. I tried to enjoy the time with my parents, but the knowledge of the coming invasion made every meal taste like ash. We reported to Fort Drake in early August, expecting to spend weeks drilling for the beach landings. To our collective shock, the Sun Kingdom surrendered on August the 14th, just as we were finishing our first week of training. The following week, we found ourselves in Seattle, loading onto massive freighters that were only half full of supplies and men. While we were 2 days out at sea, a new ruling was announced over the ship's loudspeaker that changed everything for us. Any soldier who had earned 45 points or more through combat service was no longer required to leave the mainland for overseas duty. Since we had all survived the meat grinder in Europa, every man in my unit had far more than the required points to go home. However, the military machine is rarely efficient, and we were already committed to the journey across the vast expanse of the ocean. It took 37 long days on that freighter to reach the port of Yokohama, a journey that only took 10 days on the return trip. We stopped briefly in the tropical islands and the Philippines, though they never let us off the ship to stretch our legs. We even anchored off the island of Ash, where we saw the devastating remains of the battle and the thousands of white crosses marking the graves of the fallen. It was a sobering sight that reminded us how lucky we were to have missed the worst of the Pacific fighting. We sat in the bay for 2 days watching the smoke rise from the distant ruins before becoming the second shipload of troops to land on the soil of the Sun Kingdom. We were designated as occupational forces, and despite our apprehension, we encountered no resistance or uprisings from the local population. They were a defeated people, and we were just tired soldiers looking for a way to pass the time until our numbers were called for discharge. Our entire company was stationed in a massive aircraft hangar about 40 miles north of the capital, where 250 men lived on cots. It was a strange, hollow existence after the frantic pace of the front lines. One afternoon, I noticed a flyer on the bulletin board announcing tryouts for the division's football team. At that point, I was next in line to be promoted to squad leader with the rank of staff sergeant, but the lure of the game was too strong to ignore. I had always fancied myself a decent player, so I went out for the team and managed to secure a spot on the roster. This led to a transfer into the Provost Marshal's military police platoon, which was a world away from the daily grind of the infantry. It was a comfortable position, but it eventually led to the incident that would define the end of my military career. A childhood friend of mine, who had been with me since high school and through the entire war, had been transferred into a nearby headquarters company. He contacted me one evening complaining that his unit hadn't received their beer ration and asking if I could pull any strings. Since I was in the MP platoon, I told him to swing by the guardhouse where we had stacks of confiscated local beer sitting in the back. I told him to help himself and didn't think much of it, assuming a few bottles of beer were a small price for a friend's happiness. I didn't realize that the situation would spiral out of control so quickly. The following Saturday morning, their colonel called a surprise inspection and found the entire unit in a state of high-spirited inebriation. When pressed for the source of the alcohol, my friend pointed directly back to me, leading to a prompt and unceremonious court-martial. I lost every stripe I had earned, but as I sat in that office, I realized I didn't truly care about the rank anymore. As long as the incident didn't delay my return to the civilian world, the brass could have whatever pieces of fabric they wanted. I had entered the service as a private, and I was perfectly content to leave it as one, knowing I had done my duty.